Well, good morning, everyone. I am excited today to have author David Didau. How do you say your last name, David?
Didau.
Didau.
Yeah.
Author, trainer, lecturer, speaker, researcher, author of several books that I think taken together form what I call the achievement gospel. Like, if you can do anything right in practice, this is a good start to start thinking about not what you can't do in schools or what we can't solve in schools or what we can't teach kids, but what can we do? What are the things we can do to make things better? And I call that the gospel just because the gospel is supposed to be the good news. And we have so much bad news about student achievement. It's all bad. If you're poor, you're doomed. If if you don't have the right parents, you're doomed. And this is the good news. The good news is that's not really always true. So let me tell you the couple of books. David has a book that I'm really fond of called Making Kids Cleverer, which is an interesting title. It's a clever title. Wrong Book, The Secret of Literacy, The Perfect English Lesson. Several books actually to take a look, but this last one, Making Kids Cleverer, I think is really, really important. David, thank you for joining me.
It's a pleasure.
I want to start out just ask you straight up front, like so much of what I've heard you talk about in hearing you speak and even in your writing is there seems to be a dynamic where there's a tension between faith and evidence, a tension between correlation and causation. And there's a difference between like the evidence version of pop psychology and what might be a deeper look at what the evidence tells us if we were skeptical people, if we were critical, skeptical thinkers.
Right.
So let me just ask you about three of them that I think might be a little saucy just to hear you quickly say what you think about three of the pop psychology ones. How about Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hour theory?
Yeah.
Meaning that if you do anything for 10,000 hours, you'll master it.
Yeah, which is wrong. And it's not to call it Malcolm Gladwell's theory is probably playing fast and loose. He certainly came up with the name, and he cited as evidence for his theory the research of Anders Ericsson, who he never actually spoke to, and as far as Ericsson's concerned, didn't actually engage with any of the research that he wrote. And what Ericsson's take is that whether you can master a domain in a specific amount of time is completely dependent upon the domain. So in a relatively small domain like chess, you maybe 10,000 hours of purposeful, deliberate practice might get you there. But in other domains, that's less likely to be the case. And also, because I remember when I first read Gladwell's book, I was teaching at the time, and I thought, I got out my calculator and I totted up the amount of hours that I've been teaching and went, why am I still so rubbish most of the time? And Anderson explains this, and he says it isn't just hours put in; it's the type of practice you do, and particularly, when you become competent at something, when you, as a teacher, when you get to the point where you're not running scared and you've got a sense of how to run a room and teach your subject, then you stop noticing what you're doing, and you run on autopilot quite a lot of the time. And what seems to happen is that when we get to that stage, sometimes called the autonomous stage of practice, we no longer make any gains in terms of expertise. And it's for us to improve, we have to stay in the cognitive stage, and that's where Ericsson's ideas about deliberate practice are so important, because they're all focused on forcing you to pay attention to what you're doing as you practice, and only then are you likely to improve.
Okay, so learning styles.
Yeah.
What do you make of that in terms of evidence-based, something that people believe for a long time?
Yeah, well, it's one of those things where there is, as you know, there is no evidence base, but they're very, very appealing, and intuitively they feel right, because people say of themselves, God, I really like to see things in front of me, or I really like to use my hands and sort of get into things. So I'm probably a visual learner or a kinesthetic learner, and it feels true when we say that. And so the kernel of truth there is that we all have preferences, and my learning preference is that I have a cup of espresso coffee and a small piece of dark chocolate whilst I'm learning. Now, obviously, I can learn without those things. I'd just rather not.
Yeah.
Um,
I think I have that same learning style.
Yeah, and so I think the bit that feels intuitively correct is based in the fact that people don't have learning styles, but particular content has better teaching styles. So, for instance, if I wanted you to be able to, if I wanted you to know what the continent of Africa looked like on a map, you are going to be best off if I show you a picture of the continent. No one, no matter what their preference, is going to learn that best if I make them pace it out on the floor, or if I describe the coastline to them. So, I mean, unless you've got a very, very specific learning deficit. So if you were blind, then obviously you wouldn't learn that best. But for the normal range of people, the same would go for something like, if I wanted you to learn to play the piano, I could show you some YouTube videos, I could sort of describe to you what to do, but eventually you've got to get your hands on the keys, and you have to be kinesthetic. So there are it's matching the content to the teaching that's important, not trying to match teaching to spurious notions about what children prefer.
One last one, because first of all, I have the same learning style as you. I believe espresso and chocolate is my learning style. The last one, the growth mindset. That's, I think, one of the more recent ones.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's intuitively true that if we try harder at things, if we make an effort, if we sort of that we'll get better at them. But there's I think that when you sort of get beneath the most sort of obvious parts of the claims made by the theory, then it becomes harder to find really convincing empirical evidence that, for instance, having a fixed mindset, within the theoretical framework is unequivocally a bad thing. And yet there isn't really any good evidence that having a fixed mindset makes you less able as a learner, or and that, often people develop fixed mindsets about themselves for very good reasons. So if you're getting feedback that you're not very good at something, then you're probably going to conclude, look, what's the point in doing this? I'm just not very good at it. I'd be better if I spent my time engaged in something that I am good at. And so that's that very few of us persist in the face of constant setback. So we all have growth mindsets about things that where we can see the benefit of practice and effort, and we all tend to have fairly fixed mindsets about the things we think we're rubbish at. And so, what the claim of the theory makes is that if you show children 2 25-minute animated videos, then they will you'll see a boost to their ability to learn. And if you restrict the claims made about growth mindset to just that, I haven't really got a problem. I don't. There's not much cost to showing kids 50 minutes of animation, and if they get a benefit from it, then great. But a lot of the rhetoric that's associated with it, and a lot of the claims about the sorts of things that we should be doing in schools are way beyond the evidence.
Those are 3 things in a row: the 10,000-hour theory, learning styles, growth mindset. I'm sure there'll be something new next week that will arrive that looks to be evidence-based, might be powerfully misinformed, and might do long-term damage if implemented with fidelity into systems. How big a problem or small a problem is that, you think, with research?
Well, I mean, I think there's never been an educational intervention which hasn't had some sort of evidence supporting it. You know, that everything that you can think of, people will be able to cite you an evidence base. And I think that what's really important is that the education profession is, as you sort of began by saying at the beginning, professionally skeptical. That we, you know, that I say professionally because I don't think it's helpful to just poo-poo everything and go, that sounds rubbish. I'm not saying that. I think you have to be open to ideas, and I think you have to say, okay, so what are the, you know, what are the why would that work? What are the plausible mechanisms that explain that? And if then you can't find any, then definitely skepticism seems to be the way to go. But once you found a plausible mechanism, okay, so I can kind of see why this would work, then the sorts of questions you need to ask are, in what contexts is it likely to work? So what are the conditions where this might work? Who are the sorts of children that this might work with? What age group are they? What are the particular types of content that it seems that we've got that we're best suited to? So one of the things that I've, you know, in the book I wrote, What If Everything You Knew About Education Was Wrong, I talked about Robert Bjork's ideas of desirable difficulties, and one of those, you know, very, very briefly, the idea there is that if you slow down and make difficult the conditions of practice, then, you know, you see more substantial gains over the longer term. And one of the desirable difficulties that he and colleagues of his have researched is something called interleaving. And when I first came across the idea of interleaving, I found it very, very exciting. And the idea is that instead of blocking out, you know, a prolonged period where you practice one thing, you get better and better and better at that one thing. The idea of interleaving says, well, actually, you're more likely to sustain an improvement if you split up your practice. So you do a bit of this, bit of this, bit of this, and something else in between. And at the time of practicing, you're going to see that you're not as good as if you blocked it out. But over time, you'll retain more, you'll become more skilled. And that seems plausible. You know, I understood the theory, you know, the idea of, you know, the theory of disuse that lay beneath that, and there were the good reasons to think it might be workable in schools. But then when you start to look at the evidence base for it, almost all the research is on mathematics. So we can be we ought to be, you know, if we're claiming that this is a productive use for teaching math, then, you know, we're within the evidence base. But when we start saying, you know, this is a fantastic way to teach other things, we need to be cautious. You know, that I think we can say, because of the evidence in mathematics education, you know, maybe it'll work if we try this in this other area. But you know, we need to caveat it. We need that kind of range of caution. Does that make sense?
It does. You know, as you're talking, what I'm thinking about, though, is the large group of people who have to spend their time doing the research and thinking about it.
Yeah.
And then there is a teacher in a classroom.
Yeah.
And in between those two people,
yeah,
there is a distance. I don't know what I don't know how you measure what the distance is, but there's a distance, let's just say, between the person who's going to next Monday be in a classroom teaching someone, and the person who, you know, last week was trying to go through all the theories. How does this become useful to the system? And who does this big thinking? Like, you know, are you a teacher in a classroom who's going to think through, my practice might be completely wrong, in terms of what the evidence tells us?
And that's a really good point. And I think, you know, it's researchers should research whatever they fancy. You know, I don't think they should be constrained by notions of practicality and relevance, that sort of, that's fine. But we also need to be more. We almost need a sort of, I don't know, I'm hesitate to say it, but some sort of priest caste of people, intermediaries who go, that looks promising. And so because we can't expect teachers to read through, research journals and because they're busy, marking work and preparing lessons and doing all sorts of, the great stuff we need them to do. So, whatever role, whatever writing I do is about trying to sort of interpret the stuff that the pure research that I encounter, and I should be, held to account for the way I do that. But one of the things that I really look for when I'm trying to look through the research findings that are published is, how practical is this? How easy is this to implement? Because if you've come up with a brilliant idea for, let's say, sort of improving, expanding somebody's working memory, and it potentially could be life-changing, but it's almost impossible to implement in a classroom setting. Well, I'm not going to recommend that to teachers. I think they should do things which are much easier to do. So, I mean, when I first became a teacher, there was the prevailing opinion was that almost all classroom instruction should be based around children working in groups, and that my role as a teacher ought to be to facilitate them doing group work. And there's like everything else, there's a range of some fairly robust evidence which suggests that if you do this and you have certain conditions and met, then you can expect to see some pretty big learning gains. My experience as a teacher was that it was just really, really difficult to implement all of those things. And so whilst it might have been possible to get those learning gains, it wasn't likely. And it became clearer and clearer to me as I spent time in the classroom that it was much more effective, much more efficient, and much more, in the long run, enjoyable for my students if I skipped some of that stuff and just said, look, here's some things that you need to know. Here's some activities that I want you to do, and here's some, discussion that I want you to have. But actually, I'm not going to get you to try and discover this for yourself. I'm just going to tell you because, why the hell would I want to confuse you? And that, and that idea about how easy it is to implement things really underpins the thinking behind that I put into the book, Making Kids Cleverer, which is if you take those kinds of approaches, those sort of student-centered approaches, I think they're often fantastic approaches for privileged students, or children from really wealthy backgrounds who have parental support and all the other kinds of networks available to them, that it can be a really effective way to educate those kinds of children. But for children that don't have those networks, through no fault of their own, obviously, who don't have parents that are able to share their journey through education for whatever reason, then it's inequitable to expect them to thrive in that kind of educational environment.
Yeah, and this is one of the big claims that you make when you call it the advantage gap. Something that you've talked about, and you make a pretty strong claim around. As a matter of fact, I have the quote. You say the way schools tend to be structured systemically biases everything that happens in favor of those children who already have more privilege and against those who are less privileged.
Yes,
which is a pretty stunning, take on things, because it calls the whole system into question. But tell me more about this advantage gap and how it's systemic.
Okay, well, so I think if you look at pretty much any data set that you care to mention, if you look at international comparisons, so for instance, if you look at PISA studies from the OECD, the factor that consistently correlates most strongly with achievement is socioeconomic profile, basically the wealth of your background. Whether or not that's right is a completely different question, but it seems to be true. And if it is true, is it fate? Is that the way it has to be? And to an extent, maybe there is something fatalistic about that. Maybe the children from the wealthiest, most privileged backgrounds always are going to have an advantage. But the argument that I'm interested in is, well, just because there's potentially always going to be a gap doesn't mean that we shouldn't work hard to try and minimize that gap. You know, the whatever gap there is, that would be more equitable if it was a result of effort and hard work, rather than, you know, the luck of the draw. So what I reckon is that this sort of systemic bias that exists is unconscious. I don't think, you know, I don't think for a moment that there are people in education who are nefarious, who are sort of thinking, how can I make the lives of poor people harder? You know, I don't think those people exist. They're a bogeyman. You know, they're a rhetorical device. Even people that I disagree with really, really strongly, I think they want the best for young people. And but the best that we all want is that we all want children to be creative and critical thinkers, and to be able to collaborate together and to solve problems and all of this great stuff. But my belief is that the ideas that a lot of people have for how we achieve that don't work.
That's the danger that I see too, though. That's really the danger. Like if we could point to a nefarious enemy that really did wake up every morning wanting to make poor people poorer through the education system, that'd be easier to fight than people of goodwill who are powerfully misinformed. Like people who are of goodwill who think they're doing a good thing, and they're powerfully misinformed and they have authority over children, seems like a tougher thing to solve than having a really bad character you could go after.
Yeah, sure. If there was just Darth Vader out there, you know.
Yeah, right. Exactly. If there was a Death Star, you could just point to it. You know,
get the torpedoes into that little aperture.
Yes.
No, you're right. You're right. We're fighting a. You know, I'm fighting maybe the wrong metaphor, but the intellectual battle is between people of good intent. And so I recognize in myself, sometimes I can get quite upset and angry with different points of view, but I think it's really important to recognize that, you know, that people think they're doing the best. And so you have to weigh your sources of evidence. As I said, everything has evidence. You know, there is a position out there for which you can't find evidence. I think that the evidence in favor of things like 21st century skills, generic skill education, that kind of stuff, and student-centered education, you know, it's out there, but it mainly favors children from wealthier backgrounds.
The advantage.
And I think there's also a case in which a lot of what we do, children succeed despite us. So, you know, what happens is, as a school, as a teacher, as a district, you take feedback from the results that the kids get. And so if the kids are all doing well, you think, well, what I'm doing must be pretty great because they're all doing well. Now, if I'm working in an elite private school and all my kids do well, what should I conclude from that? You know, I think there's a strong argument that it's maybe got nothing to do with anything that you've done, that those children would be fine, you know, whatever happened to them, because of their starting points. And so I think that, you know, if we only looked at evidence of research that was conducted with underprivileged groups, and we were able to say, so, you know, we're only looking at this profile of student, and now let's compare the claims. You know, that we don't really have, systemically at least, we don't really have that kind of systematic review where we just look for that kind of evidence base. But I think
what's important to me about that evidence base, if you look just at the underprivileged kids or disadvantaged, because whatever you want to call that group or class of kids, the body of research that you could look at seems nihilistic at some point, because if you start stacking it all together, the correlation between poverty and achievement, the correlation between family structure and achievement, and income and achievement, and zip code and achievement, they start to form such a strong force field to where you disavow any pedagogical intervention and you start looking for all sociological interventions. rather than what you can do in the classroom. So in terms of the power of research, the nihilistic power of research seems to me to be stronger when you talk about poor kids or kids from,
I see that point.
Yeah, the good news research seems to be in shorter supply, and actually most people don't seem to believe it. Right.
Okay. So this is where I recognize that there are potential weaknesses in my claims, because I'm making inferences about research. So one of the inferences I'm making is, how easy is a particular intervention to implement in a classroom? Because the easier it is, the more likely it is to benefit more children, and just by weight of numbers, the more likely it is to benefit the most disadvantaged children. And so looking at how simple something is. So one of the claims that I make in the book is that one of there's been a lot of, you talk about the bad, that sort of nihilistic power of education. So one of the texts that I think's had a lot of negative influence is the bell curve. Murray's bell curve, which basically concluded there's no way you can close the gap between the cognitively rich and the cognitively poor, and that you shouldn't even try. It's been tried. It just any improvement at this end has an equally strong improvement at the other end of the graph, and so you never close gaps. And that's quite nihilistic, because it is a counsel of despair. So what do we do? There's no point trying. But and
he makes it about race too, which is even more. And what he can say, what Charles Murray can say about that book is, it's all evidence based.
Yeah.
Right. Like scientists would be lying to you if they didn't recognize that there are racial and intellectual differences in populations. Right.
Sure. And
so where do you go from there when when that's your claim?
I can't believe you've asked me that question. I can't really answer it without testing it, I don't think. I think I would go along very, very clearly with the conclusion from biology that race in this term is biologically meaningless. Making claims about skin color and associating that is biologically meaningless. But there is, as Murray says, there is a wealth of data that says that different people who identify as belonging to different racial groups have different rates of achievement and different IQs and all this kind of stuff. And so what's absolutely true is that race, is a social construct. And if you identify as belonging to a particular racial group, then on average, certain things are going to be true about your background. So particularly in the US over the centuries, that being African American is highly correlated with being poorer, being socially excluded, and having all of these negative social consequences. And so the likelihood is the environmental factors that are associated with all of that are strongly contributing to these negative evidence bases. It's impossible to do much to differentiate between.
And it's not in the genes; it's in the environment.
Well,
in some ways, shape, or form.
The claim I'd accept is that at the level of individuals, your genetic makeup contributes probably quite a bit to your ability, but at the level of something biologically meaningless, there's no way it could. There's no way you could say genetically people of a certain skin color are less intelligent than people of a different skin color. It just makes no sense to say that. What we can do is to say that a social group that has been systematically biased for generations is likely, because of those systematic inequities, is likely to have had diminished cognitive environments for a long, long time, and there's no way that couldn't impact on your ability in the here and now.
And so that you just said is potent and powerful, and it's an argument that I think permeates the education debate in the United States without really being explicit. It's behind everything that people says. You know, when we talk about low expectations, when we talk about bias against certain groups of kids that's embedded in the system, it's the thing we don't talk about, but we're really talking about it, if that makes sense, all the time. But you know, when I read your work, you're sidestepping, I think, a lot of that and going straight to what should we do. I noticed that in one of your speeches, you said that you think knowledge-rich environments are a social justice issue.
Yes.
So tell me more about that. What's the social justice issue of a knowledge-rich environment?
Okay, so you know, if we accept that one of the advantages that more privileged young people are getting is going to either, you know, elite public schools or leafy postcodes where things are likely to be calmer and nicer, then it's easier for teachers to provide, you know, more challenging content at a faster pace. And if you are learning more challenging content at a faster pace, you're going to becoming more able as a result of that than if you're getting less challenging material at a slower pace. That just seems to me to be fairly self-evident. And so if we can create the conditions in public schools where we're able to teach challenging content to children of whatever their background at a pace which is broadly similar to more advantaged schools, then, you know, that we should be maintaining some of that. You know, the gap is there before children arrive at school, and it does this. You know, that school seems to accelerate social inequities. There's one of my favorite academics, a New Zealander who's sadly now dead, called Graham Nuttall, said that the ability is the consequence, not the cause of what happens in school.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Wow.
I know. It's
who is that? That's Graham. Is that Graham Smith?
Nuttall.
Oh, Nuttall. Okay.
Nuttall. And he wrote a really quite beautiful book called The Hidden Lives of Learners, where he, you know, what he did, he sort of wired up classrooms, had cameras and microphones in classrooms, and watched what kids actually did. And what I found really fascinating reading his work is that his observational findings really support a lot of the cognitive science that's out there. So a lot of these laboratory studies where people say, well, you know, this is what happens when you control all the variables. There's Nuttall's research saying, yeah, it's what happens when kids go free range as well. This is what seems to go on. And that's quite compelling.
So a lot of what it seems like the magic in your book, when I said earlier, the things that are fluid in intelligence and the things that are crystallized in intelligence, the fluid part seems to be about the things that are fixed, the things that you're not going to necessarily change. The crystallized part is where it seems like there's some promise. There's some promise of changing things. So talk a little bit more about that, the dynamic between the fluid things that are fixed and the crystallized things that you can change.
Okay, so so the one of the confusing things is that the terms themselves sort of contradict what we intuitively think about them. So fluid sounds like it should be something changing rapidly. What we know about fluid intelligence is that it does change over our lifetime. So we gain fluid intelligence as we mature, and it seems to peak in our mid-20s, and then it starts to drop off, and we start to sort of hemorrhage fluid intelligence as we age.
Really?
Yeah. And so fluid intelligence is like your raw reasoning power, your ability to solve problems about which you don't know anything. You've got no basis on which to solve them. And fluid intelligence seems to predict that kind of problem solving. Crystallized intelligence increases throughout our lifetime. So it's more likely to just go up and up and up. So there is some truth in saying that the older you are, the wiser you are. Just you're less quick, maybe. And so crystallized intelligence is your ability to apply what you already know to solve problems. So pretty much all of the problems that we face in our day-to-day lives are ones for which we've we use our prior knowledge. So, the problem solving is, in day-to-day terms, is really, really trivial. So this morning, I solved the problem about how to put my trousers on. I just I've done it before, and so it was really, really easy. There's very few problems that most of us have to solve for which we have no prior knowledge. So crystallized intelligence is strongly correlated with what you know. The more you know, the greater quantity of crystallized intelligence you're likely to have. So the findings about fluid and crystallized intelligence, how malleable it might be, there's a whole body of researchers out there who are really looking at how you might increase fluid intelligence, and most of their research at the moment is going into things like NBAC training, which is things like doing sort of mental calculations backwards, sort of holding lots of numbers in your head. And there are people who make claims that if you do this kind of NBAC training, you can see transferable increases in fluid intelligence. But then there's a whole bunch of other people who, every time the fluid intelligence guys publish this, someone else will look at their claims and go, actually, there's no real substance to them, and it's not transferable, and it's not persistent, and I think what we should conclude from this broadly is that if you were to try and emulate what the fluid intelligence community are doing, the NBAC training people, then you'd have to replace your school curriculum with loads of, backwards calculations instead of teaching, which is broadly unattractive to most teachers. So that would be your best bet. And even then, there's little evidence for seeing persistent increases. But crystallized intelligence is something we've known how to increase that for since time began. That there are well understood mechanisms for getting information that isn't currently in someone's head and getting them to know it. And it might not be easy to get children to learn stuff, but it's certainly possible. And so by that way, we can be relatively certain that we can increase crystallized intelligence. So my advice is abandon the attempt to kind of get gains in working memory and fluid intelligence in these generalizable ideas, and focus instead on increasing children's knowledge. And the logical claim I make is that it's impossible for anybody to think about something that they don't know.
Oh, that makes it pretty simple. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, people listening at home, try and think about something you have never heard of.
Yeah.
It's literally impossible. You can only think about things you know something about. So sometimes people go, "Oh, how come I can think about mermaids?" Well, that's because you've heard of women and fish.
Yeah, and in an interesting way, that comes back to an argument that people make all the time, is that we're testing kids often on things that they have no knowledge of, right? Like, or we're framing things in ways that they don't have the context for.
Yeah, I mean, that's another really important related point, because I've almost never seen an assessment in schools that isn't an assessment of knowledge. But very rarely is it couched as such.
So instead of like advantage gap, and I'm not trying to do away with terms. So let's keep advantage gap. And people talk about the achievement gap. I think more recently people have started to say, no, it's really just a test score gap. But what you just said makes me think it's a knowledge gap.
Yeah.
Like,
absolutely.
so if we close the knowledge gap, I looked for something that I had read in your book and I can't find it anymore. But there was a piece of something where you said there were like 5 domains of intelligence. 2 of them are fluid. So let's just take those out of the running. And it leaves us with 4. And out of those 4, you placed all your bets on one of them. There's the book.
Yeah. I can find that for you. That's based on some of James Flynn's thinking.
That's it. That was who it was. Yes. And I forgot what the 5 are. It's like 5 domains. 2 of them are fluid, though. So we can just get rid of those.
What they are as well. Let's see if we can find them. Basically the fluid ones are the ones that are strongly correlated with working memory and that kind of thing. So let's see what we can find.
And I think in it, you even make the claim, like, I would put my biggest bet on
Okay.
this one out of the 5, you know?
Yeah.
Um,
So these are the, there's actually 6.
oh, is there 6? Okay.
I
I got
know.
the number. See, my working memory is bad. I need
Yeah.
to improve it here.
So the first one of Flynn's sort of cognitive functions he calls mental acuity, and this maps entirely onto this idea of fluid intelligence. It's about solving problems that you don't have prior knowledge for. So that's mental acuity. He then talks about habits of mind, and so what you're used to doing is easier to do than what you're not used to doing. That makes sense. He then talks about attitudes, and he talks about that in the societies in which we live, certain things are seen as being more valuable or more important, and therefore we're more likely to get practice in them. And then his fourth is knowledge and information, which includes in that things like vocabulary and mathematical knowledge, general knowledge, all that sort of stuff. And then you've got the speed of information processing, which is basically working memory capacity. And then we have what he calls memory, which is about information retrieval, which we know that there are some quite well understood ways to make it easier for people to retrieve what they've got in their long-term memory, and we can talk about this if you want to. But the thing that I say in there, that the mental acuity and the speed of information processing, you're almost certainly not going to improve those for anybody. Habits of mind, sure, we can get into good habits, and that it's probably worth investing a bit of time on that. The societal attitudes are probably too big and too all-pervasive for us to usefully attempt to change. Not that we shouldn't, but we're certainly not going to see any short-term gains there. So the claim that I was making is about this idea of that Flynn talks about disconnecting knowledge from memory, but I would see memory and knowledge as being broadly synonymous. There are all sorts of philosophical definitions of knowledge that we could go into, but I think the one that I think is most useful is what is what's in your long-term memory.
So I want to just make sure we clarify again, because I think this is a really important part.
Okay.
So mental acuity is basically what you're gifted with already, I think, in some ways, right? Or
Probably.
It's your ability to, you're almost Mensa. If someone gives you a puzzle, you hold something in your head that gives you the ability just to solve it, even if you didn't have prior knowledge of what you're solving.
Yeah.
So not everybody's going to be born with that. We're not going to all have the same levels of mental acuity.
Well, there's no reason why we would, any more than we'd all have the same height.
Yeah, right. So we can take that one a little bit off the table. The habits of mind, is that something you're saying is fluid, or is crystallized, or is it malleable? Is it changeable?
I think we know quite a lot about changing habits. We know that that we can stop people who are alcoholics being alcoholics. If they follow a certain sort of program of action, they can change their habits. We know that it's possible to do that. It's not always easy, but it's certainly possible to change habit. Yeah. And so a good example of a really beneficial habit of mind is reading. So if you get into the habit of reading every day, and I talk about reading for betterment. And so one of the habits that I try and inculcate in myself, I signally fail with my own children, but one of the things I try and do for is read 50 pages a day of something that I think is going to be beneficial to me. And that kind of habit is just good for you. It improves the you're only as good as the stuff you've got to think with.
So as parents, teachers, educators, we won't be able to do a lot about mental acuity. No. We might be able to do something about habits of mind.
Yeah.
We could do very little about changing the attitudes of the society overall. That seems like trying to, fill a pail with a tsunami. did you say speed of information processing is something we
Yeah.
can or can't? What
We
is
can't really.
we can't affect
we
that?
we can do it in a very small domain-specific way, but we don't appear to be able to do it in a transferable way. So there's not really much point to the active. Like the brain training games that were popular in the 90s. Do you remember those? The kind of the sales pitch was that if you played these games, you'd become more intelligent. And the evidence on those is in. Brain training games make you better at brain training games, and nothing else.
And that's not just in the 90s; those are still going strong. There's whole new websites popping up saying,
"Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, whole new
That's not
As
profitable.
a matter of fact, you can pay a fee for some of them to give you brain games that help you be smarter.
No.
So your big bet then, out of those 5, really is about improving the knowledge of kids, and memory is attached to that somehow.
Yeah. So it's we've all got tons of stuff in our long-term memories that we've got no access to. Things that you don't know. If you want to get all Donald Rumsfeld about it, do you remember him sort of talking about
Yes.
Yeah. There are known knowns and unknown knowns and all of that business. There are things that we know because we can think about them, and there are things that we know but we can't think about because we can't remember it right now, but we know it. It's on the tip of the tongue. And then there are other things that we've forgotten or are just no longer aware that we have in our minds. And so some of that stuff that we have in our minds, one of the divisions I make is that there are things in long-term memory that we can think about, and there are things that we can think with. And if you think with something, it sort of becomes part of your mental architecture, and you can think with something without necessarily being able to think about it. So, a good example of something that the average person thinks with but is unable to think about is the information needed to be able to read. So if you're going to be able to read English, you need to have memorized to the point of fluency the relationships between 44 sounds and 170 plus different spelling alternatives. But you if you were to test the average person, that they wouldn't be able to bring all that to mind, but they have memorized it. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to read. So that's I think a kind of good example of stuff that you think with all of the time without being able to think about. And then other stuff like what's the capital of France? That you can bring that to mind. You know it. You can think about it. And so those. Having access to things that you want to think about is really, really important. If you can't access it, you can't think about it. And the idea of the things that we think with, that's all about practice. So that the more you practice thinking with something, the more fluent that gets, the easier, the increasingly effortless it becomes to perform tasks and so on.
So this is all great information. You mentioned a little bit in one part, just teachers may not like to teach this way. It was I don't know what we were talking about, but there was a sentence where you said that you have a part of your book where you're talking about explicit instruction.
Yeah.
There's some of us who have looked at the research on direct instruction.
Yeah.
And to my knowledge, in the United States, it's the largest educational research on an intervention ever done here in the United States to show a positive
project follow through, wasn't it?
Yes. It has
an unfortunate meaning. I don't know if it has the same connotations in American English, but
and it's really, I think the reason people may not like it is because the guy who started that project was not necessarily a classroom teacher. He was somebody who was trying to help family members or something, and happened upon a way to teach them.
Sure.
That worked, but teachers don't like to teach in that way. And you're calling for explicit instruction. That might not be something educators want to do. What do you do then?
So when I said teachers might not want to teach this way, what I was referring to was I don't think teachers are interested in doing the kind of stuff needed to improve fluid intelligence, which is getting kids to recite numbers backwards.
Gotcha. Okay. The rote stuff.
That seems to be fairly sort of intellectually bankrupt to spend time doing that. No, I think. Well, it's really interesting. What I think, this is my belief. I don't have empirical evidence for this. But as a practicing teacher, I was told that there were right and good and proper ways to teach, and that if I did those things, my students would benefit. And I went out into my classroom and tried those things, and I struggled and I regularly failed, and I felt that the fault must be with me. And what I tended to do was that when somebody came to visit my classroom, I put on a show for them. I'd show them what I thought they wanted to see. But when they left, we'd collectively breathe a sigh of relief, and we'd go, let's go back to business as usual. And that I remember a prolonged period where I was really, really trying to get some of these student-centered approaches to work in my classroom in the belief that it was the right thing to do. And I spent a good 6 months sort of laboring away at doing this. And I remember I had this class of 15-year-old students, and one lesson, I can't remember what it was that I'd chosen to do with them. And a couple of them at the front said, "Can you not just teach us?" and I said, "No, because that would be bad for you. So instead, I'm going to do this stuff." And I look back on that now, and what was that? What was I thinking? What was I? Well, I just kind of believed that if all of these people telling me that this was the right way to teach, they must know what they're talking about. They can't. Surely they can't have been winging it. I remember being observed in a school inspection, and the inspector came in to watch my lesson, and it was I was a fairly new teacher, and it was a very challenging class, and I was trying to do what I thought they would want to see, and it was a shambles. It was everything except a brawl happened. It was pretty bad. And then after the lesson, I was being debriefed, and the inspector was saying, "Well, that wasn't very good." And I said, "No, I can, I know it wasn't good. What did I do wrong?" And the inspector said, I said, what would you have done? And the inspector said, "Goodness me, with that group, I've got no idea." And that's that's been my finding, that the people who say this is the right way to do things are either either sort of restricting that to a certain sort of context, or they've got no suggestions at all for how average teachers can make that work in normal classrooms. And that what works in normal classrooms, and I think what children find enjoyable and compelling, is enthusiastic, knowledgeable teachers who love their subjects and who bring that joy and that life into their subjects. And they say, "Hey, guess what? Here's some cool stuff. Let's talk about this stuff. Let's find out what you want. Let's discuss it. But I'm just going to tell you things that are brilliant, and then we're all going to do something with that information." Kids love that. They get excited by that. I mean, I think one of the rhetorical positions is that, if teachers talk too much, they're really boring. And boring teachers are obviously, do you know that the Ferris Bueller's Day Off?
Yes. Yes.
And there's a character playing who is, the archetype of the tedious teacher. And then we have these cuts between the teacher and Ferris having a fantastic day, and clearly that's boring. But one of the things that teacher needs is some intervention on how to talk better, actually better at delivering content, rather than saying some teachers are boring, we shouldn't ever deliver content. Some teachers are boring, let's help them do it better, because the speaking is an evolutionary adaptation that's really, really effective at communicating new information to people that don't know what you know. It's probably why it evolved. And
well, I fear you might be bumping up against another popular imagination research thing that I should have put at the beginning when we talked, which is the Sir Ken Robinson stuff, right? Schools are killing the creativity of kids. And, the thing about teachers being boring and things being rote and things being, is killing the creativity and the joy of schooling for kids. And that's a strong, powerful thing right now. to confront?
Well, I think there is some truth that some of the ways that we do schooling, some of the high stakes approaches to accountability and assessment are not a barrel of laughs for most students.
Yeah.
But that doesn't presuppose that we need to get rid of, as Sir Ken would say, get rid of all subject boundaries and give as much attention to dancing as mathematics. There's no logical connection between those ideas. That I think that there's an idea inherent in that argument that in order to increase children's creativity, they need to spend more time doing creative subjects. And that creativity somehow only exists in the arts, which is just frankly offensive. That mathematics is creative, science is definitely creative. Everything has the capacity to be a creative discipline. It strongly depends on how you go about teaching the domain that you're involved in, and that if schools are killing creativity, the answer is not to set up a system which will cement further social disadvantage, which is my claim. The solution is, that children are bored by things often that they've got no way into. They don't understand lessons because they're missing too much background knowledge, and so
they don't have a
context. Give them the knowledge that they need to access the material, and suddenly they can come to life and enjoy it. One of the totems for progressive education is the late great Jerome Brunner, and he's famously said in 1960 that you can teach anything to anyone in an intellectually coherent, respectable way if you sequence the material properly, if you go about it in the right way. It's not true to say that only certain sort of things can be enjoyable. That's what I think anyway.
Or teaching in one way, or we're coming up on time. Okay. I want everyone who has watched and who is listening to definitely get this book, Making Kids Cleverer, by I'm sorry, I messed up your last name again, but David Didau. It's a very. I actually want to start a book club with a couple of friends who I think would do very well with this. And after we all read it, come back to you again and talk about it. I don't want to butcher the main and the big idea, though. So in the last couple of minutes here, can you just give us the main big idea?
Right. So the main big idea is that the intelligence is strongly correlated with all sorts of positive life outcomes, like longevity, like creativity, leadership, critical thinking. All the things that we value are strongly correlated with intelligence. And if the bit of intelligence we can increase is crystallized intelligence, that is about quantity and quality of knowledge. And so if we want to increase the life chances of our children, we should find ways to increase the quantity and quality of what they know, and that education is the perfect vehicle for trying to do that. And that then it would follow that certain ideas about instruction come to the fore because they are likely to lend themselves to increasing the quantity and quality of children's knowledge.
Excellent. I thank you so much for your voice, for your book, and everybody watching and listening. The first 3 people who email me, Christopher@activist.com. Again, Christopher@activist.com. First 3 people that email me get a free copy of David's book. I'll ship it to you directly from Amazon. I am sure it will be COVID free when it gets there. If not, you can wipe it down and let's do a book club. Cool. Everyone, David, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's been a real treat.
I appreciate you. Thank you.